by someone else within the British Empire. 3 days later, Wilberforce died, having seen his entire life's dream come to fruition. And he's often credited with not just being the architect of abolition in England, but the architect of abolition in all of Europe, because once England got out of the game, being the powerhouse, said, hey, you guys should all get out of the game, and then they enforced it. And they were able to, sometimes with firepower, enforce the ending of the slave trade, which is a remarkable moral victory in the history of man. And it all started with one guy by the name of William Wilberforce, who God got a hold of. So that's a story of how one Christian can make an incredible impact in their government. And more than that, a lot of scholars think that when Wilberforce first entered government, there was no one, or maybe one or two tops, people within the British government who could, by our standards, be considered a Christian, like in a meaningful way. After Wilberforce left, there was literally hundreds which you could meaningfully call a Christian. Not only did he change his government, he changed his culture. He was a remarkable, remarkable historical figure, but most people don't know about him. And Eric Metaxas wrote a book, and he said something very profound in the introduction. He said, if there's ever anyone who needs an introduction to the world, it's William Wilberforce. But if there's ever anyone who should not need an introduction to the world, it's William Wilberforce. But William Wilberforce said this, and it speaks magnificently to our time. He said, let them, he was speaking of Christians at the time, boldly assert the cause of Christ in an age when so many who bear the name of Christians are ashamed of him. Late 1700s British Empire sounds an awful lot like Earth, like modern day Western culture. And he goes on to say this, who are ashamed of him, and let them consider it's devolved on them the important duty of suspending for a while the fall of their country, not by busy interference in politics in which it cannot be but confessed there is much uncertainty, but rather by the sure and radical benefit of restoring the influence of religion and raising the standard of morality. No, he capitalizes the R in religion. There was no other major religion in England competing at the time. He means Christianity. So he's saying you want to change your country, you don't do it by just busily throwing your hat in the political ring. You do it by restoring the influence of religion and raising a standard of morality. So he's saying if you want to change your country, feed it some Christianity, and he has a standard. And it's important to note that Wilberforce had a standard he held his personal life to, and he had a standard he held his politics to. And it was the exact same standard. He was consistent, because what was true then was true now, and whatever is true to Wilberforce personally is true for a country. But this whole conversation begs the idea of truth in government, which is not necessarily controversial, because everyone's for truth, but then you flesh it out, maybe not everyone really is for truth. And there's this phrase that's often used that says, you know, so-and-so is legislating their morality. I literally read it just a couple weeks ago. Someone was being accused of legislating their morality. And the go-to response for politicians to walk it back, and they'll say, oh, it's what my constituents wanted, it's just something that I feel is important to the people of my district, and they'll walk it back and they'll try to avoid that stabbing question as much as possible. But the correct response is this, is that, yeah, I'm legislating my morality. Why don't you try to legislate your morality and we'll have out which one is true. Because there's no such thing as a moral void. Think about it. On the issue of slavery, where is the morally neutral ground which governments must occupy? Either it was wrong or it was okay. There's no middle ground, and in so many issues today, there's literally no middle ground. Either something is evil or something is not evil. It's answer A or B. So there's a truth that can absolutely be applied to government. But then often Christians are accused of being intolerant. All the time. They'll say, you Christians are intolerant. But when they say tolerance, they don't mean tolerance because they purposely misdefined it. What they mean is pluralism. Now let's say I take a look at this computer and I'm like, hey, look at that cup holder. And you're like, Micah, it's a computer. I'll say, isn't it great how we can both be tolerant and both be right at the exact same time? That's not true, because unless you otherwise qualify it, one of us is wrong, maybe both of us is wrong. But in that case, I would be wrong, because unless it's somehow a computer cup holder hybrid, which is a terrible idea, you have to have one person be wrong. So that's not the idea. Say again?
Unless it keeps it warm.
Yeah.
That's just a bad idea. But anyways, but the best description I've ever heard of how to define tolerance is that tolerance is like clicking a pen. So in a room, there's one person clicking a pen, and then there's 3 responses to it. The first group of people don't hear it or don't care at all, so they're totally oblivious to it. For all purposes of them, there's no pen clicking going on. The second group of people love it. They get out their pens, they click along, they adore it. Third group of people don't like it at all. They dig their fingers into their chair, but they don't do anything about it. Who can tell me which of those 3 is being intolerant? In my last 3 groups, they got the 2 wrong answers before they got the right answer.
What? Can you tell us one more time what the?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I talk so fast. The first group responds to the pen clicking by not even noticing it or not caring. The second group loves it. Third group hates it, but they don't do anything about it. Which of those three is tolerance?
Tolerant?
Say again?
None.
I said one of them.
One of them
I
is.
think the third group.
She's like intolerant.
Wait, who said that?
Me. Third
Starburst,
group.
no starburst.
You can keep it for the kids.
We'll throw it at random.
Yeah.
Hit my shoulder.
Okay, that's better. I should be more responsible.
Should be more tolerant.
Anyways, then you're absolutely right. It's the third group. Because the first group doesn't know, that's not tolerant. The second group loves it, that's not tolerance, right? And the third group doesn't like it, but they tolerate it. And that's what tolerance is. And tolerance isn't the universal virtue that all men and women must have, like it's painted to be in culture. Tolerance is actually an inherent neutral. For example, I mean, there's lots of you guys in here, and I think we've got a handful of Packer fans, right? And we've somehow reached across sport lines to unite together. That's a good form of tolerance because we all realize it's a non-issue. But then Wilberforce could not tolerate the slave trade because he thought it was intolerable, because he thought it was immoral. So there are some things that you actually should not tolerate, and to tolerate them is absolutely the wrong call. But then Wilberforce was thinking about getting out of politics because when he was first converted, he did not understand how he could be both a Christian and a politician at the exact same time. He actually thought he had to quit Parliament and go live in the country and pray piously for the rest of his life. That's what he thought being a Christian meant because he didn't fully understand the impact. So he's getting all sorts of advice from all sorts of people, but he writes to William Pitt, who was an influential man in his own right and pretty smart and very well spoken, and would soon actually be Prime Minister of England. Now, it can't rightly be said that he was in a meaningful way a Christian, certainly not at this point in his life. But he writes to him, he says, I'm thinking about getting out of politics. And Pitt writes back and says, bad idea. And he says this in the letter, and it's profound. He says, surely the principles as well as the practice of Christianity are simple and lead not to meditation only, but to action. But today we're told, keep your faith personal, keep it private. And while it's deeply personal, it is not private. It cannot be. Because there's impact that your life has outside of the four walls of the church, the four walls of the home, and the outside in the world. There's actually real life things that your Christianity is not only okay to, is essential to, because they will be destroyed without it. And I really want to drill it to your guys' mind that all laws presuppose morality. Laws about slavery, allowing or banning, also presuppose morality, like we all know. But then most people never think about the minutiae of how to run a government, how morality matters to that too. In fact, a common argument for people who say there's not a universal morality, they'll point to common things like traffic law. They'll say certainly traffic law has no morality behind it. They'll say there's just a traffic light there to stop you from crashing into someone else's car and maybe hurting them. But then you have to ask the question, why is that wrong? Why is it wrong to crash through a red light and hurt someone else's person or property? Well, maybe it's because both persons and property are sacred, and obviously humans and persons are way more sacred than property is. So there's an undergirding law to all things. And James Wilson, a founding father, said this, far from being rivals or enemies, religion and law are twin sisters, friends and mutual assistance. Indeed, the two sciences run into each other. The divine law is discovered by reason, and the moral sense forms an essential part of both. He calls law a science. And when we think in those terms, we realize things like slavery are wrong, not because they've been written in a book, but because they've been written in the whole universe by the Creator himself. That there's some pre-existing law that says slavery is wrong, and we as humans do a good job recognizing what has been set in place long before we are born and will be around long after we are. And then St. Augustine said this, an unjust law is no law at all. There's a limit to what the government can do. Remember our babysitter example? Now let's say the babysitter says you must tie your little brother or sister to the table leg. The child ought not listen because there's a higher authority that says don't do that. In the same way, if the government says you cannot worship God, or you must do this, or you must do that, and there's a law that God has put in place that says don't do that, the Christian ought not do it, despite the consequences. So there is a limit to the government's power, absolutely. It cannot intersect God's law, but it certainly has the authority to try to follow God's law and create laws that fall within that spectrum. So that being said, we're going to take just a real quick break, shake it off, and then we'll be back to things in just a couple of minutes. Don't go too far.
So what do you think? 10 minutes? 15?
Can we cut it to 5?
5? All right. Gang, there's a restroom. Take a left right here. It's on the right-hand side. And there's another one at the top of the stairs. So we'll see you back in 5 minutes.